Become part of the change towards a regenerative future. Our aim is to promote self-empowerment and educate our course participants about regeneration, so that people all over the world can redesign their communities. Look deeper inside our programs and courses to find your way within your community to transform the world. Sustainability is at the heart of all of our courses and projects. Sustainability design education is our mission. Join our programs, support us, and let's fly together.
Hello everyone, I'm Jane Rasbash and welcome to the Gaia Education webinar. I'm here to interview Ross Jackson, who is the chairman and founder of both Gaia Trust and Gaia Education, and has also been supporting Global Ecovillage Network in many ways for many years. So welcome, Ross. I first met Ross at Newbold House at one of the GEES meetings when the Gaia Education curriculum was being developed. And that was around 2005, when my colleague Prashar Hutnawata was invited to contribute. And then a year or so later, we welcomed Ross and all the GEES in Thailand at Wongsanet Ashram, where we contributed more. And it was at the start of Gaia Education. And I was invited with Jonathan Dawson and Ross to be on the first board of Gaia Education. And I served with Ross in that capacity for 10 years. So we go back quite a long time in history. Ross has such an amazing background, a background in sort of business and finance and all that kind of really amazing corporate things. But he also foreign exchange, and this provided financing for Gaia Trust and Gaia Education, which supported a more sustainable world, which I think, Ross, is your passion to, really support this. So it's just been an amazing journey from someone, who has really been committed to this for such a long time. So Ross's huge business acumen fuels his NGO work towards regenerative change. And this webinar will focus on his new book, The Bad News, The Good News, the economics of collapse and the birth of a regenerative society. So welcome, Ross. The book is divided into two main parts, the bad news and the good news. And we're going to start with the bad news. So welcome, Ross. I think the first question I have is, you're talking about in the start of the book that our civilization is hardwired for collapse. Can you explain why you think a collapse is inevitable and what a collapse would look like?
Yes, the basic problem is overconsumption. We are living not only by the yield of our nature, but we're also beginning to live off our capital. In other words, we're also consuming the capital as well as the yield. Let me give you an example. If we think of the civilization as an airplane flying across the ocean, and the passengers are pulling out the screws out of the airplane one at a time. Well, we know that at some point, that airplane is going to get weakened so much that it's going to crash into the ocean. And that's essentially a metaphor for our situation. Now, according to the ecological footprint analysis, we are consuming roughly 70% globally more than the annual yield of nature. And some countries, for example, the United States and Europe, are actually consuming close to 300% more than their pro rata share. And that means that if they were to get back to, let's say, the normal share, they would have to reduce their consumption by as much as 75%. And what I'm basically saying here is that is not realistic. That is not going to happen. You could call that the psychological problem, that even if we decided that we wanted to reduce, it's pretty much impossible. That's why I call it hardwired.
Yeah, thank you. You also write about 3 sort of fatal premises that in the current economic system that is dominating the current worldview that are driving this overconsumption. And the collapse. So can you kind of say what these 3 fatal premises are?
Yeah. Yes, I think perhaps the first and most important one is the idea of perverse pricing that our economic system gives us. There is a theorem in economics that all economists agree upon that says that the production prices of the economy should include all of the costs. And that means also including the environmental and social costs. But it's never been possible in practice to do this, partly because of competition and partly because it's never been possible to find an international mechanism for doing this. And the result is that things like oil, for example, are grossly undervalued. And this is probably the single most important reason why we have such a crisis going in: global warming and the mass extinction of many species, and the idea they're heading for collapse. A second reason is the idea in economics that man is motivated solely by self-interest and the pursuit of wealth. But we know this is not true. Even economists admit that, but they make the assumption anyway. And so in both of these cases, they're basically assuming that these costs of externalities, like ecological rather, and social costs are zero. And they're assuming that man is basically psychopathic. That is to say, he has no empathy. This is totally wrong. And the third reason is, well, I would call it the idea of unending growth. Now, we all know that you cannot have unending growth on a finite planet. And yet that is the objective of every country. Even the richest countries are continuing to try to increase their wealth, their growth. So those are the 3 basic reasons.
Yeah, thank you. Quite sobering to hear that. You make a statement in your book, and I'm quoting here: a government that is a currency issuer does not have to borrow, no matter what you hear or read from an army of politicians, mainstream economics, journalists, websites, etc. Can you just explain what this means and also your reasoning for this claim?
Yeah, this is a very widespread misunderstanding. Most people think about the national economy as if it was the same as a company or a budget of a family, but it's really quite different. A currency issuing sovereign state can actually buy anything it likes in its domestic currency. It is unconstrained in its ability to purchase anything. Quite opposite a company which has to borrow, if it does not have the cash on hand. Now, I would point out that this model does not apply to the Eurozone, because the Eurozone basically, the members do not issue their own currency. So when they borrow money, they do have to borrow money in basically a foreign currency. But the rest of most of the countries in the world do satisfy this condition, and they do not have to borrow. Now, I could perhaps give you an example of how this works. Let's supposing the government wants to spend $10 billion on some military equipment. So what it does is it opens up an account with, say, a private bank, say JP Morgan, and transfers immediately without any background, just creates 10 billion in that account. And so on the balance sheet of the government, we have on the asset side, we have a 10 billion deposit at JP Morgan. And on the liability side, we have what we call the bank reserves. This is the sum of all the bank deposits in the private sector with the central bank. Now that bank reserve is basically a liability or a debt, and it also is paying a small interest, like 0.5% or something like that. So if the government now takes that $10 billion and buys military equipment from, say, Raytheon or some other company, it then creates a deficit. But that deficit does not have to be financed by issuing government securities. In fact, it's already financed by what we call the bank reserves, which are paying 0.5%. But most politicians don't quite get it, and they think that because we have a deficit, it's just like a private company, that we have to issue bonds in order to cover the so-called deficit. But that's quite incorrect. We don't. It's not necessary. Basically, when we issue bonds, it's a monetary action. The only effect it has really is that it affects the interest rates, but it does not affect the real economy otherwise.
Okay, thank you. You write that a balanced government budget would eventually lead to the collapse of the economy.
Right. Yes.
Which is kind of carrying on from what you've just said. Could you just explain a bit more about that? And I think, again, this is kind of contrary to what most politicians who would consider chronic deficits as irresponsible. I think it's following on from what you said previously.
Right, they would, but they'd be wrong. I think I can best explain it. The method I use in my book, the model I use, is based on what I call sector analysis. You can think of the national accounts as consisting of, let's say, 4 different major sectors. You have householders, ordinary families. You have the bank sector. You have the production sector, and you have the government. Now, the first 2 of these, the householders and banks, tend to have a positive surplus. Okay. One of the rules about the sector analysis is that the sum of all of the surpluses has to be 0. So if you have an excess in one sector, you must have a deficit in another sector, because we're looking at cash flows. And so the first 2 of these sectors, the householders and the banks, tend to have a fairly stable positive surplus. So if the government has a 0 surplus, there's only one place for the final sector, the production sector, to go, and that's to have a deficit, because the deficit has to equal the surpluses. What this means is that the production sector is going to be in permanent debt, and that debt is going to increase year after year with interest. And eventually, the debt is going to get so large that the banks are going to stop giving credit, and the whole system is going to collapse. So how do we prevent it from collapsing? There's only one way to prevent it, and that is that the government has to run a deficit. When a government runs a deficit, that enables the production sector to run up a surplus, or at least to decrease its deficit to the point where it's up to, let's say, to balance. So this is the reason why I say that a balanced budget for a government is actually a disastrous and irresponsible strategy. In fact, a government which is issuing its own currency must run a deficit pretty much permanently, and it will get bigger for every year.
Wow. And many people seem to be worried about a growing American deficit and the size of the national debt. Yeah, but you're saying that neither is really a problem and that the national debt can be easily eliminated. Can you explain about that in simple terms?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that when the government spent these 10 billion to buy some military equipment, it created a liability, which we call bank reserves of 10 billion on the balance sheet.
Yeah.
Now, an ordinary politician in that situation would probably say we have to issue some government securities for 10 billion, which I say is wrong. But supposing they did anyway, what would happen? What would happen is that the balance sheet of the government would change slightly, and that you would have 10 billion additional treasury securities and 10 billion less in bank reserves, with the result that the total liabilities would be unchanged. So this raises the question how we do define the national debt. The traditional definition that is used normally by most economists and the public is to only include the government securities part. Whereas I'm saying I think a more correct definition, what I call the broad definition, would include both bank reserves and government securities. And this illustrates the fact that when we issue government securities, we're in fact not increasing what I call the broad definition of national debt is unchanged. But it would increase the narrow definition. But I think the broad definition is a more correct one. And that there's no burden whatsoever on anyone just for this reason at all. We don't have to issue any government securities. And I'm not alone in this view. There's a small minority of economists who agree with me on this point, the so-called MMT economists, they agree with me that the national debt is really no burden, not now and not in the future.
Thank you. One of your concepts is that there's actually three kinds of money, which have very different roles in the economy.
Yeah.
And that, having them as one money supply disguises what's really happening. So maybe you can define these three different sources of money and what their roles are, and elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, this is a very important point. Now, the traditional way of looking at money by mainstream economists is to consider it as one big lump sum we call the money supply, without differentiating which functions the different kinds of money might have. Whereas in my way of looking at it, we have to distinguish between these three different kinds because they have quite different functions. Now, the first kind I call real economy money, or bank credit. This is the credit that banks provide to corporations who are producing a product, and it basically finances the goods in process, the period between production and sales. And that's basically what enables the real economy to function. The second kind of money is what I call speculative money. And this is created from the savings of householders. Householders will always save a certain portion of their income, maybe 9 or 10%. And that 10% of the money goes into a different account, into a savings account, if you like, and is available for investing in, rather, I wouldn't say investing, but placement in existing assets, stocks and bonds and property and so forth. Now, a certain portion of that does go back to the production sector as investment, but not all of it. And so there is a buildup of this speculative money. Again, building up year after year, and it'll become bigger and bigger unless we reduce it with say, wealth taxes or capital gains taxes. That speculative money will keep increasing year after year, but only, remember, for existing assets. Now, the third kind of money is what we talked about earlier, bank reserves. These are the accounts of the private banks together with the central bank. And this is a very special kind of money because bank reserves cannot be lent out to the public. They cannot be used to buy speculative assets. They can basically the only way they can be used is to lend to other banks to clear the obligations of the private sector with the central bank and to pay interest on the central bank government bonds. So this is what I basically call dead money, because it has no connection with either the speculative money nor with the real money economy. It's basically dead. And so I'll illustrate the why it's important to distinguish my three kinds of money from the so-called money supply, which combines them all. And I can illustrate this with the so-called quantitative easing, which was introduced by the Federal Reserve after the 2008 crisis. And what the Federal Reserve did at that time was insert a tremendous amount of liquidity into the banking system, because it had been sort of frozen up. A lot of banks were wary about lending to other banks. And so there was a tremendous lack of trust in each other and liquidity. And the Fed had also hoped that by putting all this money into the banking sector, that it would encourage the banks to lend money out and get the economy moving again. Now, a number of economists and a number of commentators on economics were screaming to high heaven and saying, this is going to cause hyperinflation. All this extra money in the economy is going to mean more and more inflation. Well, what actually happened? Nothing. In fact, prices actually fell slightly. Why? Because they did not understand that an increase in the money supply does not automatically mean an increase in prices. In fact, the increase in the so-called this dead money, which has no connection with consumer prices, in my opinion, would not cause inflation, and it didn't. So this is, I think, a good reason for saying why we do have to have three different kinds of money if we want to understand how the economy actually works in practice.
So the dead money doesn't need to be dead. Is that what you're saying?
Well, dead money, it has a very limited use. That's what I'm saying. It's not, it has no contact with the speculative money. It has no contact with the real money, which determines, the pricing structure is determined by householders and their purchasing of consumer goods.
Okay. Another theory that you reject is that inflation results from excessive spending. This is building on what you just said. Yes. And I don't understand this question, and develop an attentive theory of inflation. So can you explain what an attentive theory of inflation is, and what is your alternative?
An alternative theory, I would say, of inflation. Yeah. Well, the mainstream theory about inflation is so-called based on the so-called quantitative theory of money, which says that basically inflation is the same as the growth rate of the money supply, the total money supply. And they would argue that one evidence for this is the fact that there is a positive correlation between inflation and the total money supply, so defined as so-called M3. But in my way of looking at it, there's another factor which is also very highly correlated with inflation, and that is the increase in the nominal wages. And I consider the nominal wages also as a very important source of inflation. So what I did is I did a regression analysis, which included both inflation, both the money supply and the nominal wages, and tried to explain inflation by these two factors. And the very interesting result was that the coefficient of the money supply factor went to 0, while the coefficient of the nominal wages was quite positive. And so what we have here is an example where you have a positive correlation, but it's not a causal correlation. It turns out that the money supply is also highly correlated with nominal wages. And that's because when we increase the wage bill, we also increase savings, which increases the speculative money supply, which is part of the total money supply. So we have basically the nominal wages are driving, you might say, both of these factors. So we had a non-causal positive correlation with the money supply. So what I determined from this analysis subsequently was that there are basically three kinds of inflation in my theory. One, the long-term average growth rate of prices, which is what we define as inflation, I find in my analysis is proportional to the productivity of labor productivity, the long-term growth rate of prices. The second kind of inflation is the short-term cyclical variations about this long-term curve. And this is what is determined by the interrelationship between prices, wages, and the level of employment, the so-called Phillips curve, which is well known in economics. And this explains the short-term cyclical variations. And the third kind of inflation is what I call cost push inflation, which is caused by international events which affect every country. Things like, let's say, food crises or energy crises, which increase the cost of these internationally, and they affect every economy. And also supply chain interruptions. An example of cost push inflation would be in the 1970s and 80s, where OPEC increased the price of oil dramatically, and that affected every single economy. And another example was just recently with the COVID-19, supplemented by the Russian-Ukrainian war. Those two things coming quite one after another caused quite a substantial cost push inflation, which affected every country and which has gotten pretty much back to normal now. These cost push inflations are typically temporary, but they could last a few years until they get back to normal. So those are the three different kinds of inflation in my way of thinking.
Thanks. That's quite a gloomy picture, and thank you for explaining it. Let's move over to the second part of your book, which is about the good news. And, you know, at first, before we go there, you've worked with the Eco-Village movement for many years, and to date, do you think there's been any impact on the prevailing economic system and current worldview of what we've done in the Eco-Village movement over all these years?
Actually, I don't think so. I think the Eco-Village movement is still very marginal in not really a factor in the mainstream yet. I think it could be very important in the longer term, and I can come back to that if you like. But right now, it's not a major factor at all. No.
Yeah, that was my thoughts as well. Even though it's a very valuable movement, you know. But as we move over, turning to the second.
So your question was? Hello? Have we lost Jean? We seem to have lost Jane here somehow. Well, maybe I'll just carry on with a couple of comments on other aspects which we talked about beforehand. One of the questions that Jane had for me was how this post-collapse society might come about in practice. And,
hello, Ross. Let me just say that Jane connection seemed to have lost, so I'll be replacing her. But
yeah, I think I lost connection. I've just reconnected with my phone. I don't know what happened there. Sorry about that. Let me.
Okay, well, I can just, Jane, while you were gone, I was going to answer the next question anyway.
Yeah, good.
Which you were going to ask, and I'll just repeat it.
Just summarize, yeah.
How you wanted to know how this post-collapse society might come about in practice, and I would say to that it's impossible to say just how it's going to happen. There are too many unknowns. I mean, we could have wars, we could have famine, there are many, many ways this could happen. My major point is that either we at some point learn as a civilization to live within the limits of nature, which means living off the yield and not off non-renewable resources. Either we learn to do that or we go extinct. There's really no third choice, in my opinion. But how long that will take, nobody knows. It could happen within 50, 100 years. It could happen 300 years. And it may happen in waves. There may be this collapse and then recovery and collapse and recovery until we finally figure it out. But we're going to be here on this planet. We could be here. At least it will be habitable for at least 1 billion years. And that's an awful long time. We've barely gotten started. So what I'm trying to look at in this book is to say, what would a society look like that was basically able to exist and continue for that as long as the planet is habitable? And the only way that can be done, I'm saying, is if we live just off the yield of nature, no more.
So what do you see, how would that be? What do you see as the major differences between the current society and the ultimate post-collapse society that you're envisioning? How would that look?
Well, I think there are two things. I think the main thing is a difference in worldview. And the difference is that our current society treats nature as resources which can be exploited. The new worldview, which is based much more on the sort of the worldview of the indigenous people, says, no, we are part of nature. Nature is sacred. We cannot destroy it. It's the basis of all life. That's the one and the most important difference. And the second is there will be a tremendous difference in the economics of such a society, because there will be a ceiling on the amount of total production that's possible. If you're only going to live off the yield, that is to say, the plants, the animals, water, etc., it's at your disposal each year, that's going to put a limit on the total production. And that's going to mean that there's also have to be a limit on population. Population is going to have to be controlled, and the population will have to follow the total production. Now, the total production can be increased in the society by increasing labor productivity and resource productivity. And so it won't be a stationary society by any means. It will have the opportunity of growing. But population will have to follow the total production and not the other way around.
Yeah, I read that part about the population, and I'm curious how that could be, to control the population. Do you have any? Well,
it's going to require a very different kind of international cooperation. There's going to have to be a broad agreement on these principles if we're going to survive. That's basically what it comes down to. And people have to realize that is simply a condition if we're not going to destroy ourselves. Many other animals do the same thing. They control their population. It's not that difficult for humans to do the same.
Yeah. And you mention in the book that the eco-village movement will play an important role. Can you say more about that?
Yes. I think the eco-village movement, in a way, is like the modern successor of the indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. We have much in common in terms of the kind of values that we appreciate. And these are in particular the values which I think are going to be necessary in this, what I call this regenerative society. The values like regenerative agriculture, for example, community living, sharing, and the idea of having a sacred nature. All of these things which the indigenous peoples would agree upon are also the same values that we have developed in the Ecovillage movement. Another reason why I think there could be a very important in a time of crisis and chaos in the world in the coming years is that the ecovillages can be places to go to rebuild as things start falling apart all around us.
Yeah.
We saw an example of that in the Ukraine war just 2 years ago when it started up in February of 22. A lot of people in the cities had to flee from their homes, and many of them discovered ecovillages out in the countryside where they could get food and shelter. There are about 40 or so such ecovillages in the Ukraine, and many of them increased in size by 300-400%. And
Wow.
and at the same time, they cooperated with the Ecovillage Network of Europe, Gen Europe, and many of these people were channeled out of the country and into various ecovillages in Western Europe. So it was in fact one of the original reasons back in 1991 when we originally decided in Gaia Trust to support this ecovillage movement was the very idea that they could be places to rebuild in a period of chaos, which we saw coming, by the way, already 30 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. You write that one of the most important new institutions could be universal public banking. Can you explain what that is and how it would be more advantageous than private banking?
What it is basically is that all retail banks, those that accept deposits from the public, would be owned by the public in one fashion or another. It could be the state, it could be provinces, it could be communities, but they would not be private anymore. And one of the reasons for this is, one of the advantages is from the first place that all deposits, both for individuals and for corporations, would be guaranteed without limit. Right now we have maybe 50,000 euros limit or something like that. So all deposits would be absolutely guaranteed by the state. But perhaps even more than that, one of the most important reasons in order to have this public banking is in order to get a handle on these externalities, these social and environmental costs that are being caused by the production sector. By having public banks, that means that the public will be the ones who are making the loans to these companies, and we will have control over the level of the interest rates and the level of the taxes, and can selectively charge different taxes and different interest rates for different companies, depending on the degree to which they are causing social or environmental problems. So the idea is we want to continue to have a certain degree of, let's say, new ideas appearing in the sector. It's not going to be a top-down society in that sense.
Yeah.
There will be a lot of room for individual initiative and new kinds of products and new companies, but they have to be controlled by the public in the public interest, so that we don't get back to situations that we have today where we have too much pollution and so forth. Yeah. Now, another advantage, just a minute. There's another advantage is that having public banks can eliminate the financial risk that we have today. Today we have the two kinds of banks, the retail banks and the investment banks and hedge funds and so forth, all under one hat, which means that the retail banks today are financing a very highly geared speculation and creating tremendous financial risk. I am assuming here that the public banks would not do that. They would not permit their banks to support geared speculation.
Yeah, Jan has put a question related to this. I'll just read his question in the comments. What would be the impact of private banks' nationalization? So I guess that's the public banks in terms of planetary sustainability, which you've touched upon. And you mentioned, and you mentioned a limit in wealth. Do you see that as a possibility in the new future? So 2 points, one about the sustainability of the planet and one about limits to wealth.
Limits to wealth?
Well, You mentioned a limit in wealth. Do you see that as a possibility in the near future? That's the question from
Well,
Jan.
I think it's going to be necessary in this new society to have a much greater control over the development of wealth. And I think we're going to have to introduce some form of wealth taxes and capital gains taxes so that we do not allow things to get out of hand. I think this society is likely to be a much more egalitarian society, but of course there will be differences in income and wealth. That's okay, but they shouldn't be too extreme. And this is one of the things that the people will have to determine is what is an acceptable level. And then to keep that level, they will have to introduce wealth taxes and capital gains taxes in order to get the kind of distribution that they feel is appropriate.
Yeah, there's another question. Will a UBI, is that universe?
Yeah.
What is UBI? A universal
basic income.
Oh, universal basic income. Oh, yeah, great. Yeah, will a universal basic income be a necessary step in the foreseeable future?
Yes, I think it's a good idea, and it will certainly be so in a regenerative society of the type I'm talking about, that no one will be left behind. I mean, the whole idea of having this kind of a new society is that the well-being of the citizens is the absolute first priority. And one of the things we can learn from the indigenous people is the concept of leadership by what do we call it? By having the interests of the citizens as the first priority. And that's what we're going to have in this new society, which means everyone will be taken care of. And that could include a universal basic income as well. Yeah. There are many ways it could be done. But some variation of that absolutely necessary.
Yeah, and thinking in the long term, I think you mentioned that in the book as well, about thinking for future generations as well. Yeah. I'm curious, you're talking about this indigenous kind of culture, bringing it in through the eco-villages and things. But what do you really think are the drivers for behavioral change, but at individual level as well as community and governments, for these kinds of Gaian changes for a regenerative worldview? What's going to make this happen? What's the psychology behind it? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the change is going to come about first and foremost because we reject the old paradigm. We realize that we've been making a lot of mistakes in our economic system in particular. It's been a disaster. And the way our leadership is elected is a disaster. People are interested in leading positions in politics for power and for personal wealth, whereas in the indigenous society, the chief is often the one who gives the most away, not the one who collects the most. So it's going to be a question of rejecting those old models and finding some new ones. And it's going to be based to a great extent, I believe, on experimentation. It's not going to be any simple solutions, but solutions will evolve through experimentation and by finding out what is working and what is not working within this paradigm, within the idea of the value system we're talking about here. There could be many, many different ways of solving these problems, and nobody can design the whole thing in advance. It will evolve through experimentation.
Do you have any thoughts about spirituality or engaged spirituality with regards to this kind of change that's required?
I do, in the sense that, well, first of all, I do have a very personal interest, and much of my motivation has always been based on a spiritual basis. But I think also it's very characteristic of the indigenous peoples they often also have such a spiritual basis. And I believe this will become much more common as we move away from this very exploitative society into a more generous, more modest society of the type that we're talking about here. The spirituality will come very, very naturally, I think, to our successors when they get to that point.
Thank you. And, you know, there's one question I'd just like to finish with, and then maybe we'll open for some more questions from the floor. You know, I feel that our generations have really messed up, even though a lot of us have been working for social change and societal change to the best of our capacities. But we've left, you know, these three premises you talked about have just left this devastating situation for the next generation. So how can we really support the younger generations to really be a force for regenerative change? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that perhaps the most important thing is not to give up, not to give in to despair. I know a lot of young people are saying they're not going to have children. How could you bring children into this kind of a society? But I think it's possible to say, let us find a more constructive way of looking at it. Let us find a positive vision. Now, there are many organizations around the world who have such a positive vision for the future.
Yeah.
The Ecovillages movement is one of them, but there are also many others. So, my particular background is in the Ecovillage movement, and I would say that certainly one very positive vision that you could adopt is to say, I will join an Ecovillage, or perhaps even start a new one. That gives you a lot of energy, and that gives you a lot of focus on the future and making change, rather than, let's say, negatively just fighting the establishments. And look to the future, look to the positive future.
Yeah. There's another question come in. When will the bad news and the good news be available, and where can we purchase it?
Yeah. I will be publishing the paperback version on the 8th of February, and an ebook on the, I think, 6 weeks later, the exact date I don't have in my head, sometime in mid-March. And as a follow-up to this webinar, I'll be in touch with the participants and make a special offer for them of some kind so that they can participate.
Thank you, Ross. And there's another question from Jan. In terms of international cooperation to build global resilience, we've seen some of that losing traction in the recent times with the war scenarios. Do you see that gaining any strength anytime soon? Well, you mentioned about the eco-villages in Ukraine, but I think this is sort of looking at another perspective on how war scenarios can also impact. Have you anything to say about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the most significant events, probably for the last 100 years, is happening right now at the global level, and that is the emergence of this BRICS and BRICS Plus group of countries, headed by mostly the developing countries, because they have a very different vision from the old, you might say, declining organization, which was very much based on the United States and its allies, and which, if we're realistic, they've been following a very exploitative policy towards these developing countries for many, many years. And in the meantime, the developing countries have developed to the point where they've become quite highly technologically efficient. They've become much richer and than they were, much more powerful than they were. And they are not interested in exploitation. They're interested in trade. They're interested in commerce. They're interested in having friendly relationships. They're not trying to dominate anyone else. And that is, I think, a really important shift. And I think that eventually it will spread to the entire world. I think this is the right model. And I think that eventually the Western countries who've been following the American model realize that this could be a new global model where you have a multipolar society, many different countries with different foreign policies, but working together peacefully and respecting each other's interests. That's what I see coming, and I think it's very, very significant.
And you think that will shift these war scenarios?
Not in the short run, but I think we're looking at an evolution over maybe 10, 20, 30 years, and I think we'll see significant changes in that direction.
That's a huge change.
I hope we won't have more wars, but there are some forces that prefer war. We must admit that. But I don't think these BRIC Plus countries are definitely not looking for war. They want to have a peaceful trade. That's what their major interest is.
Well, let's hope that comes to fruition. There's another question from Tom Greenwood. As society collapses, eco-villages can form a resilient and regenerative model for living. But eco-villages as they are now have not yet solved many of society's problems. So I think you talked a little bit about this. Can you say a bit more about this? Oh, he's talking, Tom also adds, for example, healthcare, cultural diversity, mobility, trade, security. What do you think is the opportunity to innovate further and solve these issues in the eco-village setting?
Well, I don't think we can expect ecovillages, which are often very sort of small communities of between 50 and 300 people, to be solving all those kinds of issues. What they can do is demonstrate on the ground what it's like to live in a sustainable way as much as is possible within our current society, which is not easy, by the way, because there are a lot of things working against them. But what we can learn from the ecovillages is their value system. Yeah. And if you apply that value system to these various issues which you're raising here, then that is where we can eventually find solutions. And I think we will find them eventually in this, what I call the regenerative society. By applying those values on a much larger scale, I mean, we have to really lift it up to the level of governance. And decided this concept that I couldn't remember the name before, but the name I was trying to recall was servant leadership.
Servant leadership. Yeah.
Which means that the people at the top are there to serve the interests and the well-being of all the citizens, and not the interests of any particular subgroup of that. And that is where we're going, in my opinion, in the long run. Yeah. We have to go that way if we're going to survive, actually. Yeah.
So is there one piece of advice or one step you could recommend for the listeners that they could take this forward to actually towards the regenerative society?
Well, I'd say read the book, maybe as a first step.
Read the book, yeah.
No, but seriously, I mentioned before that I think we have to take a positive view and not give in to despair, even though at the times ahead are going to be very, very difficult for everyone. But we have to keep a grain of optimism, and it helps to have to join an organization which has a positive view, a constructive view about what kind of a future they're trying to create, rather than, let's say, giving up and trying to fight against the establishment all the time.
Yeah. So staying positive and really coming up with an inner strength towards regenerative change. Yeah, I can see that's important. Yeah. So I'm just having a look to see if we've got another few minutes, and there's another question from Nicholas Patton Philip. How do we embrace the present level of poverty and increasing mass migration to make sure no one is left behind? Ooh, that's a big question.
Well, actually, poverty, several studies have shown that poverty could be wiped out very easily if we just directed a lot of the money which we're now spending on military equipment You know, I mean, it's not that difficult. So, but how do we get our leadership to actually act that way? That is the really big problem. So I don't see any easy solution to that. But the money is certainly there. It's certainly possible to do it. It's very sad that we don't give a higher priority to the well-being of ordinary people around the world. Now, some countries do. China, in particular, has been noted for raising hundreds of millions out of poverty over the last 20, 30 years.
Where did you say?
China, over 20 to 30 years.
Yeah.
And they've done it by a different model from the model which is used in the West. But it's been quite successful.
Thank you. Are there any closing words you'd like to say, Ross? Because we're just about out of time. And is there anything you'd like to say to everyone before we leave? Some words of encouragement.
Well, I'd just say I'm optimistic that we're eventually going to achieve what I call the Regenerative Society. Yeah. It will probably be long after all of the people currently living on this planet are around anymore. But our successors will build this. I'm confident of that eventually. So let's wish them the best of luck.
Thank you very much. So thanks, Ross, for a really enlightening talk and discussion. And, you know, for anyone who's interested we will be sending out an email about Ross's book. There'll be a special offer for people on this call. And also you can look at the Gaia Education website if you're interested in any of the courses Gaia Ed is running. But I just really like to say a heartfelt thanks to Ross. And, you know, I really hope people do really look at this book and read it thoroughly, because, you know, it's really about regenerative futures, which I think is the way forward for the planet and the people and all humankind. So thank you very much, Ross.
Thank you, Jane. Nice to see you.